Good evening, everyone. This is Ravi Gupta. I am editor-in-chief of a magazine called Digital Learning. I am also the CEO and founder of Elets Technomedia Private Limited. And we have been bringing out this magazine for last 15 years, and we have been covering about innovation in education from preschool to the higher education. And today we are joined in this chat on this webinar with Dr. Marisha. She is Chief of Academics and Quality Systems, NSHM Knowledge Campus, Kolkata, Durgapur. And welcome, Dr. Marisha. Thanks for joining us here.
Thanks, Dr. Ravi. It's always a pleasure to be connected with you personally and professionally. Elets has always been a beacon of academia for me, and it's always truly a pleasure to be here. Thanks, Ravi.
Thank you. We are honored to have you here. And we have an exciting set of audience, more than 100 people have already joined on the Zoom. I welcome them all. And we are also live on the Facebook channel of Digital Learning and Facebook channel of Elets, where at least I think that 1,000 people are seeing us live at least. So what we are going to discuss today is a interesting journey of an academician who has studied and taught in Australia, and then chose to shift to India and teach here. It's not yet common to see this happen. Normally, people study here and they want to move to Australia to teach there. So part of this chat is about that, what prompted an Australian academician to look at India as a teaching base, and her views on the how she is seeing the Indian higher education system as an outsider. Like we want to get an outsider's perspective on what we are doing, and her observations and her ideas and suggestions about the pandemic situation and how it is impacting the higher education ecosystem. So to start with, I'm going to request Dr. Marisha to give an idea about your education, school education, higher education, doctoral education, research, and your journey till date, please.
Okay, thanks, Ravi. It's been a really interesting journey, quite unusual for many, I guess, many higher education leaders. I had started way back when I was had just come back from the United States, and I'd been in boarding school. And then I fell into nursing. I didn't know what I was going to do, so I sort of fell into nursing, and I went out there and did that, and then I did craniofacial surgery. And then after some time, I guess we were getting to the time where nursing was extremely, started to be very bureaucratic, and I went in there for the people. So interestingly enough, I went into architecture, and from architecture, I then went into higher education. That's a very quick journey, over quite a few years, but I went into, and I decided I would do a PhD in the ways that we think. And so obviously I went on to an academic path. So I had been in architecture for some time, and then I went into an academic path. I was, I guess you would call a normal everyday faculty. And then I began to become a bit restless. You know, what more is there to this world than simply just Australia and just I guess a privileged Western approach. And then at the time, I actually got invited to teach at University of Cambridge for 3 years, and that provided a really interesting context for me because, you know, obviously the UK is very, very different than Australia. There's a lot more people. It's a very complex higher education system. very much more multicultural, I would say, than Australia. Then after that, I went back to Australia, and I became dean of a business institute. And then I realised, you know, as a self-reflective thinker, I realised that I was beginning to work with far many more global people. And I thought to myself, do I actually know anything about Asia or Southeast Asia? Do I know anything about India? Do I know anything about the world where, you know, the second biggest population is, and where a lot of our students will be coming in the future? And the answer, of course, was no. I'd never been to India. And so I decided, you know, both on a personal level, you know, who am I as a leader in senior leadership? If I've never faced adversity, how can I demonstrate resilience? If I've never dealt with a crisis, how can I be agile? And, you know, all these questions. And so when you really think about yourself and who you are as a leader, as a manager, I then decided madly that I would leave my job in Australia as a dean, and packed everything up and came to India. Personally, a huge learning curve. I learned more about myself, who I was, what I stood for, how far could I go in terms of adversity. And I think it was really, really important for me that first year. But since then, having, you know, worked in northern India, so in Rajasthan, and then I went up north and did some, you know, a lot of traveling. I think I've probably seen more of India than many Indians. But I then came here to West Bengal, and it's really been quite a really interesting experience, because so many Australians, so many people in the Western world don't realise how diverse, how different India is. In so many, you know, you can travel 1 hour away and it's so different. It's like being in Europe, and I've spent some time in Europe. It's different, you know, from Delhi to West Bengal it's almost like going from, I don't know, from London to Stuttgart in Germany. It's that different. The language is different, food is different, culture is different, everything is different. So I think for me, that's a very short snippet of, I guess, where I came from.
Fantastic. Thank you. Tell me that how, when you have been in India now for some time, how different is the Indian higher education ecosystem from the Australian or the UK higher education ecosystem?
I think you can't compare apples with oranges, I guess.
Yes.
And that's really important. And one should never put a Western context onto an Indian context. I guess the way I've thought about it is that in Australia, we've reached a point where, how do you improve? Where do you go to next? They're already, you know, you've already got a policy for everything, literally everything. You know, nothing ever goes wrong. But yet, I think, and in the UK, it's the same. I mean, but let's put aside our pandemic at the moment. But in India, I think the context is getting there. It's really developing. It's really coming to its own. The understanding who India is and what it stands for and its culture, and trying not to take on the mistakes of the West is really, really important, and having a measured approach to it. I think the Indian higher education system, yes, there are issues. We all know that there's issues. We all know that, you know, there are different complexities and all the rest of it. But India has to allow time to unpack itself as to who it is. And, you know, in terms of higher education, for too long, a system has been placed onto it. And now it's about, okay, we're trying to move away from that and trying to discover who we are, you know, who you are as, you know, having an identity in higher education, I guess. If you know what I mean. If I can shortly make a context, India education has been multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary for so long. Like, Lord knows you've seen so many temples, you've seen so much architecture that integrates architecture, astronomy, engineering, geometry, mathematics, everything. It is so interdisciplinary. And then along comes the British that actually starts to push away all the aesthetic side of things, all of the beauty, all of the nature, and just packages everything in a STEM box that was so, there was just Isaac Newton 2.0. And I think now people are beginning to say, okay, we've had our STEM, but now what about how do we put it all back together again?
Yep. Tell us you have mentioned about some of the differences, some of the complexities. Tell us how this in this pandemic situation, the situation with COVID-19, how are higher education institution coping up, and how what might be a strategy around it? So I think you have a small presentation around it, like if you could, want to refer to it and you may show it to our audience, it will be very nice. Yeah.
Okay. I'll go into that, but just before we start, I do want to say that I was just talking to Ravi before we started, and I'm talking to the audience here, and my friend Raj Gururajan, he's from Chennai, and he's in Australia. He's been in Australia for 35 years. He's a head of School of Information Systems in University of Southern Queensland. And he was talking about the main difference between Australia and India in this context is that India is so agile in its thinking and its doing and its understanding. You know, you throw a worldwide pandemic at it and it's like, TK, no problem. And, you know, you just get on with things here. Whereas in Australia, it was like, you know, what do we do? How do we deal with this? You know, and, you know, going into crisis talks rather than just getting on with it. And I see, you know, overnight, people just got on with life here and, you know, as it does. But I think it's really commendable. And I believe that Australia and the Western world can learn a lot from that really agile thinking. So do you want me to have some sort of discussion about my...
Yes.
Okay. And my apologies for those of you. I do sort of slip into sometimes a little bit of Hindi. It's probably a habit of mine, so excuse me if I sometimes do so. So let's not go through this like a lecture. It is about just trying to give a couple of key points about, you know, how have we moved from a pandemic pedagogy to an online learning and teaching strategy. And of course, bearing in mind that India is, of course, predominantly face-to-face. We know that we have the regulatory bodies talk about, you know, the 75% attendance and face-to-face and all the rest of it. We understand that. There is a world that is able to take the planned online learning and teaching and the face-to-face in a blended way and provide a high-quality student experience. I think that's really important to remember in all of this. I don't think that we should move completely to distance ed or complete online learning and teaching through all of this. So what are the global HEIs, higher education institutions? What I noticed in all of this was that, particularly in Australia and in the UK and in Europe, I was watching this unfold from February. And from February, I was very much aware of what Vietnam was doing. Vietnam was already closing down very early in February. They'd shut everything, and then they were already going online. And then I was watching how everyone else was doing. What I could see that many had used blended learning, but very few were really able to seamlessly go online. The students want an equitable experience, you know, overall between, I want face-to-face, and my students here at NSHM, what are we going to do if we can't see our teacher, how will we possibly learn? So there has been definitely that fear. Addressing practical classes, that's something that I'll touch upon in the end, but practical classes have been a challenge, and particularly when we have a lot of, NSHM is predominantly practical, with optometry, pharmacy, engineering, design, fashion, media. So how do you actually deal with those practical classes? But what tools do we need to use? And I'll talk about those tools in a minute. But it is important to remember that it's not the medium that matters, it's the learning experience. It doesn't matter what tool you use in the world, it's always important. So put simply, pandemic pedagogy is simply responding to an emergency. That's what we have to remember is at the moment, most people are doing pandemic pedagogy. So they are doing that emergency remote teaching. It's not planned to be online. It's the result of a crisis. But how do we rethink about the way we do things to planned online teaching and learning? Two very, very different ways of thinking, because of course a typical lecture in a lecture theatre is, with whiteboard, with PowerPoint, whatever, and you've got the face-to-face and, you can run through your slides, all the rest of it. That just doesn't happen and it shouldn't happen in an online learning environment. You really need to think, we at the start of everything, we thought about inclusion, equity and continuity. So of course it's very difficult because many people that come from the cities, I've spent quite a bit of time going through villages, traveling through villages, to villages, all the rest of it, in my travels here in India. And it's very easy for people in big cities to say, oh, we'll do everything online. But then what happens when you go to a village and there's no Wi-Fi? Many students of the poorer communities don't even have smartphones. How do you deal with that? So how do you think about how we include? How do we actually create an equitable experience? But how do we continue with our classes? And that's been the biggest challenge of all. Planning, how do we plan it? Now, not many people have thought about planning. I guess they just think, oh, what's the current tool that everybody's using? But you have to think about, what are the faculty used to? What can they transition over to? What are they comfortable in using? What are the students comfortable in using? You don't want to make the tools so hard to use that the teacher spends more time trying to learn the software or trying to learn the technology than actually doing the teaching. So we had to think about 4 things: usability, shareability, multimodal, and equity. They were the key things. So we were thinking about planned pedagogy. 2 parts are critical in online we thought about. So the synchronous and the asynchronous. So put simply, synchronous is live, anything that's live, via Zoom, via Cisco WebEx, via Google Collaborate, etc., etc. And then, of course, asynchronous is Moodle, Blackboard, any kind of LMS. So we're thinking about those kinds of things. We had asynchronous tools at NSHM, but we were thinking, is that going to be the right tool to use? And then what kind of synchronous tools we use? Now, I'm going to go through this very, very quickly. We had criteria. I had criteria, so you've got functionality, accessibility, and then of course you've got your sub-criteria in there. I can share this with you. The technical aspects, so of course you've got a rubric here which you're looking at this. This is Anstey and Watson in 2018 have provided this tool, so it's very easy to find on the web. Mobile design, so how easy is it used, is it usable on a smartphone? Privacy, data protection and rights is a critical thing, and you all would have heard about the Zoom issue that come up. And, obviously there are issues around that, but how did we deal with that? Social presence, the idea of people being able to connect with each other. I think that many of us are actually either, if you're living by yourself, you're fed up with your own company, or if you're living with your family, you're probably a little bit fed up with your family as much as you love them. But the social presence online is really, really important. And teaching presence, how can I get how does the tool work for the teacher? And of course, cognitive presence. your cognitive presence is something that was in my PhD, but it's actually how do you engage and how much are you with the teacher while they're teaching in this synchronous methods. And then we looked at, why would we, why are we using these tools? How are we going to engage our students, and what will the outcomes be? And I always talk about that. Why, and we can again share with that, but we're looking at the purpose, we're looking at how students will learn, and then looking at different ways of collaboration, creativity, critical thinking, etc. that comes with Bloom's taxonomy. So how do you actually get people to move from the lower order thinking skills, so memorization, understanding, right through to higher order thinking skills? How do you use creating, evaluating? And I can talk to you about that in terms of some of the exciting tools that I used way back when I was at QUT. So it is possible that you can explore different worlds and different ideas using the higher order thinking skills whilst doing something which seemingly can be quite boring as online teaching and learning. And you're thinking, of course, about the outcomes. What are you going to do? What are the outcomes for the students? Class should never be class just for merely the sake of it. We should always think about what are the outcomes for the students, what are the outcomes, short term, medium term, long term, and what about you as a teacher? What are you getting out of it as well? So implementation, making it happen. This is where I will try and keep it short and sweet as well. So we've got governance, of course. You have to think about the stakeholders, the leadership, ITES and examinations, the faculty, but predominantly the learners. Who are the learners in all of this? Sometimes it's very difficult because theoretically you've got an idea, you want to go with it, but then how do you get everybody else on board? Cohesion, coherence and connectedness is really, really important. And try to keep that in the centre of all of the teaching and learning, which I had done. Now, tracking goals, for me, the tracking, understanding, wait, what are we doing? What's happening? And I think it's important for all people that's what I was saying, is like, think like a designer, like sometimes you may do something and it just doesn't work and it falls flat on your face. And you have to take stock what is working, what isn't working, and sometimes you have to try an iterative process to see how will this work better if I do something in a different way. It's a little bit more challenging when you've got a college of 6,000 students. I mean, that's always going to be a challenge, but you can always tweak and modify. For me, I had to be far more aware of planning things properly, given that we have so many students that we deal with. So yeah, but I still criticize myself and think, could I do this better? How could I change things? Could I be a bit more flexible? Understanding new worlds. I think part of the beauty of coming to India is meeting people like Ravi, and having a shared world. The academic world is truly a world that embraces each other. In terms of, if I'm struggling, who do I reach out to? What kind of ideas, what kind of knowledge can I share with somebody else, and can somebody else share with me? I think that's really important, to think of us as a new world and a connected community. It's always wonderful to be able to reach out to fellow thinkers and fellow doers in the academic world and say, hey, look, I'm struggling with this. Do you have any ideas? I think that has always been the absolute beauty of academia. And one of the 4 things I always say to my staff, let's think about the presentation. How many times have I been in meetings here and there's a dog barking outside, or somebody's cooking right next to somebody. So just remember that. Planning accordingly, using different forms of teaching. Death by PowerPoint is one thing, and here I am giving you death by PowerPoint, but I'm trying to keep it keep it short, sharp and shiny. The student first, and realistically, I think all of you online would know that how isolating, how challenging this pandemic has been, how lonely. You know, people might not be alone, but they may be lonely. And that's very, very interesting and important to think about, is people's mental health. I mean, I'll admit there have been days that have been really challenging for me. It's now 32 days now for me in lockdown. And of course I have nobody else here. I don't even have a maid, of course. I don't have a maid or anyone else. So it is a challenge. It's really challenging. And so you think about your students and how they must be feeling. Like, they're adults, they're coming into adulthood, they're discovering each other, they're discovering themselves as adults. And all of a sudden they're going back to being younger than a 6-year-old, you know, being with mummy and daddy all day. So it's a real challenge. Timetabling, remember that, you know, running classes back to back to back to back. And those of you who have been on Zoom or video conferencing constantly all day, every day, you know that you'll be well. Good. I really like that. And I'm, you know, the architect, the designer in me loves a good presentation. So, but anyway, so there's this world called Second Life. It's just amazing. You can, like, you see health and safety, health and medicine. There's virtual, you know, operating theatres. There's even NASA is present on this, you know, in this virtual world. And we actually taught a subject called, I can't remember what it was called. It was a landscape architecture subject. I know the subject code was PSP 270, and I've forgotten the name of the actual subject. Anyway, so we actually, you know, literally went in, and the first subject that Steph Gard and myself, he was a Swiss guy, and we were lecturers together in QUT. And we were there as avatars. So that's me, that person there in the red, that's me. You know, we'd had students that had come in as an avatar, so as a virtual person, and you would chat to each other, you could change your outfit, and you could, you know, go and find free clothes or free trees and landscape, all the rest of it. And anyway, so that was one. And it was very, very successful. The students were a bit resistant to it at first, or what is this, a game, and all the rest of it. But the way we wove it in and the teaching actually live was really, really interesting. Now, another thing, now the second picture, the bottom one is the QUT space station. So the space station was where I taught, the subject was called, I think, something space. I can't remember the subject. I remember the subject code again, but I can't remember that it was something spaces. So anyway, I was talking about, you know, how do we actually understand our bodies in space? You know, how do we move throughout space? How do we navigate a two-dimensional space around us? And why, as architects, don't we think about things in 3 dimension? Because in the International Space Station, I've done some projects with NASA and European Space Agency, where we looked at the analysed an internal space module. So a module is that round thing that it plugs into the space station there. And with, you know, like, we were looking at how people, you know, survive and live, and how lighting affects living in the International Space Station, a real project. And then in this project, in this virtual world, it was about, why don't we ever think about 3-dimensional space? We always work in square meters or square feet, but why do we never work in cubic meters and cubic feet? Because of course there's always above us and below us, and, you know, you're thinking about it. So anyway, it was really, really quite fascinating, because architecture students began to think about, you know, what do we do with the space of heads? What do we do, you know, when we're trying to navigate, you know, horizontally? What do we think about, you know, in terms of who we are and when we navigate through space? So there was really some interesting things there. These are sectional views. Is actually looking at this work in space. They had components of a space station. They had different areas. So this whole entire space station was designed for a crew, and different people had different quarters. Some had living quarters, some had laboratory quarters, some had workspaces, and then there was obviously hygiene. How do you deal with hygiene? How do you deal with food and reproduction and all the rest of it? So so that was really, really interesting. So there's some images there. So thinking about different ways and different tools we use for online learning. So as I say, as an almost summary, you have a wealth of tools to use, but choose and use wisely. When I say that, you really have to resonate with the tool that you're using. If it's clunky, if it's difficult, if it's nothing but a headache for you, then don't use it. If it's going to be a headache for you, then it'll probably be a headache for your students. Do something that's fun. Explore different worlds, and I would suggest that fun when you're teaching. You teach, I don't teach much anymore and I miss it. But you teach for so short a time in your life that you should really, and I say short a time because really are you 25, 30, and then you then retire at 60, 65. But how much of that time do you really enjoy what you're doing and what you love? And it is such a short time in the big span of things. So there, that's I'll stop sharing my screen now, and then
Fantastic.
Ravi, do you have any other questions?
Fantastic presentations. Like you can look in the chat. So many people are appreciating it, and it's very, as you said, going from jugaad to a structured method of thinking, right? So it was very structured, very nice. And asking you beyond the PPT, like how you are seeing, like you are seeing the situation globally. The pandemic has spread, and even in the US, it is like there is trouble in Europe, in Australia, everywhere. So how are you seeing the sessions globally starting? When, or will it be late or
not? Yeah. Or not. I think look, there's still institutions struggling across the Western world. Like I think people get so wound up with strategic planning that they stop. They don't know where to stop the strategic planning and actually do the work. And I think that's where a lot of us Westerners, a lot of us foreigners get stuck. But I think, look, I would say, looking at a global context, I would, not just because I'm here and not just because I'm talking to you, but I've thought about this, and I have a self-reflective journal, and I do really honestly believe that India has grappled this far more swiftly. Yes, we have issues with examinations, yes, fine, but we have, just doing it online so quickly without worrying at all, without creating a big hoo-ha about it. I think India is light years ahead of so many organisations. I really do believe that, really do believe. And yes, we're all struggling here, and we have a lot more issues to deal with here, than majority of other countries, I would say, So I think that we're doing really well in India compared to the rest of the world, where they really are still struggling in a lot of universities and higher education institutes.
So, Marisha, there are some questions people have been asked. I've asked on the Q&A box. So, if you want to pick up some of the relevant ones, or which appeal to you most.
I'm happy to even answer questions that maybe don't appeal to me.
What I'm saying is that time is limited, so you can select.
Yeah. So what kind of questions are most predominant? You've been watching this, Ravi. So what have been the predominant questions?
So are you able to see the Q&A A box?
Yes, sure. There's some people that are saying good evening and introducing each other to each other, and that's great. And I can see good evening.
No,
Do we have
you are seeing the chat.
the chat? Okay. Sorry, the Q&A. Okay. So
Yeah,
the
yeah.
Q&A
Q&A,
I
yeah.
have. Okay. In this pandemic, the most challenging situation is connectedness to all students together, and especially while assessing their performance, how to manage that. That's a big question to answer here, and I would be more than happy to have a discussion again where we can actually have a Q&A about this. Connectedness to all students together. It depends on where your students are from, and it depends on what your socioeconomic students are. Here in West Bengal, we have students who are from Northeast India that have a different context than, say, Kolkata, and also in Durgapur. So I can talk about another time, and perhaps Ravi will have me back in order to discuss the solutions around it. But yeah, how do you... We've actually created a mentor and a buddy system in a very short time. How to balance pedagogical strategies online with marrying offline and physical needs meets digital during a pandemic. Well, during lockdown, I'll be honest, there's only online. But then how do you actually then take the fully online to blend that and marry that with other ways? Now, as I said to you, I talked about the subject that I taught, you know, we actually had physical labs, and the students we could actually see when we're doing this studio online. So we blended we were all completely online in Second Life, but we also could see each other face to face. So you can still blend and marry the two successfully. How to monitor strict whole exam environment through online exam. There are so many different ways of assessment, and exams is just one way of assessing. I keep on telling people you can still have an exam and still you wouldn't necessarily have to monitor. Like, for example, you know, if you set the question in an exam, you ask the student, who am I as a student of NSHM? What does it mean to me? What am I learning now, and how can that be applied to my discipline once I graduate? And that, how can you cheat in that? That's a very self-reflective exercise. So to monitor strict exam, yes, you do an online, you can use tools like Zoom for checking to see if students are cheating. But maybe it's about considering making the assumption that students are not going to cheat, and set the examinations and set their assessment so they don't have to cheat, like open book exams. Open book exams, the hardest you can possibly get. The way you set up the questions is really interesting. So open book exams is almost like swearing, I think, to many people. But anyway, what will be the effect of the pandemic on higher education in upcoming years? I think people will, first of all, value each other and the human connectedness. Second of all, I think we'll start to work in more efficient ways. I think third of all, I think there'll be much more trusting employees to work. And fourth, I think it'll change the way our students think and do things. And they will have to learn to become far more disciplined. And it doesn't matter if the students are here in this country or in Australia, they're still lacking in discipline in many ways. But hey, some of us always are. So that's okay. What will be the role of e-learning in this pandemic situation, specific in rural areas? Again, it's about the connectivity, and it's about how we can connect and create an equitable experience. We'll have to learn and discover that. Objective type only, can we ask in online exams? No, again, exams is only one type of assessment. And so I think we should really think about that. So exams is only one element of assessment. There are so many different ways to assess students, and lower order thinking skills are typically through multiple choice exams. Critical thinking, self-reflection, presentations, designs, all the rest of it is typically higher order thinking. I'll answer a couple of other questions. Do you think India is leading West at the education front too during this pandemic? Yes. We here in India have absolutely been far more agile. By agile, I mean far more adaptable and able to move quickly to transition into online. I think that has been really, really important for and very, very quick and a very quick transition. So again, I think India is far more responsive and agile than a lot of the West has been. And I'll take one more question. Okay, the final question is, can an e-learning process replace chalk and talk methodology in the future? I said at the start that online teaching and learning should never, ever, ever completely replace face-to-face. I've known throughout this pandemic that it's really, really challenging to be alone and to do things alone. We need to be together, and I don't think that online learning will ever, ever replace that. Ravi?
Marisha, yeah, you want to take one more question if you want. Yes, you are back.
Yes, I'm back. Sorry about that. It seemed to disappear. Now, did you say that there's one more question? Time for one more question?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I think it would be, it would be really interesting to actually have another session about online and all the rest of it. If you had time, Ravi, during this long period.
Dr. Marisha, we don't have any positive time at all. So, like, if you want to answer a few more questions, go ahead and do that.
Yeah. So this is taking up design studios is a big challenge. Do you have any suggestions? Yes, design studios are definitely. Well, the two examples that I showed you, the landscape architecture and the interior architecture, were both within a university where we actually had face-to-face classes with the students in other classes. So we actually ran an online design studio completely online. So it is possible to run an online design studio like this in either an environment where you're actually able to see the students or not able to see the students. So yes, I think design studios, there's all sorts of possibilities.
You may answer some more questions, Marisha. Don't worry about it.
Yeah.
We have time.
Okay, I have time. Okay. So much of the questions are actually related. The idea of examinations, assessments, how do you deal with Wi-Fi, all the rest of it. That takes a far longer time to deal with because you're talking about issues that, I'll give you an example. One of the issues that actually this answers some of the questions. When we decided we would go synchronous and asynchronous, which is core elements of online teaching and learning, we went Zoom for our synchronous and LMS. We have an LMS through TCS Ion as the asynchronous. And the problem was that we didn't anticipate that the rest of the country would be using Wi-Fi also. So how did we actually deal with those issues? So bearing in mind that Zoom takes quite a bit of Wi-Fi, how do you actually deal with that? So we had to consider that we would do one-to-one sessions. So we chose chose WhatsApp to connect with the students that couldn't actually connect in other ways, because we couldn't, coming together, the students all coming together on Zoom, it takes an awful lot of what we call bandwidth. So we actually had taken on a lot more work and decided that we would connect with students one-to-one on WhatsApp and share the recorded lectures with them online, so they actually could feel they're part of that community. And they have built on their own sort of sub-communities of learning and learning from each other in that. So that has been one of the outcomes which we found incredibly challenging, especially in villages that are further out, out past Durgapur and in the northeast, and some were also in Nepal, which were really interesting. Do you think a holistic development of students can be done through online teaching? That's interesting. I don't believe so. There are things that one can never replace, definitely. And having been a nurse previously, and obviously an architect, it's all about people. We have to be and learn from each other as people, as humans, our behaviours, our nuances, our non-verbal communication. That's really, really important. So how do you actually teach things, across a video conference that you actually are best learnt face-to-face? I think, no, you can never, ever replace complete training online with face-to-face, definitely. Definitely not. I think, again, there is that whole dichotomy, and it was really interesting because a couple of years, or more than a couple of years, about 5 or 6 years ago, the then Vice Chancellor of QUT got it in his head that he would be able to get a far greater output of research and far greater research funding if everyone just did their teaching online. And he didn't actually really realise until somebody had taken an series of online classes with him, that he realised that online actually misses a big part of the human element, but it's also extremely difficult to get certain concepts across, and it takes far longer a time than you actually do by doing face-to-face. And so there are some other questions. Are we heading towards a paradigm shift in education? That's an interesting question. Are we, or are we just using different tools? I think there is a paradigm shift maybe in the pedagogy. I don't know whether it would be in the curriculum. The pedagogical approaches may be different and the tools we use might be different in terms of a paradigm shift in that. I would like to actually envisage a world where we actually start to think differently in education rather than simply just transition to a different tool or teach a different way. I think in order to think differently, like for example, going back to the so many questions we were asked about examinations and assessment and all the rest of it. I think the problem is the fixation with the MCQs and the examinations, and then there's also the fixation of how do you stop students from cheating. But my question is, what more ways can we assess students on their learning rather than simply remembering and regurgitating information? So I think that if we were to actually have a paradigm shift in education, that would be my biggest wish, my biggest hope, that we could move towards assessments that, especially here in India, that really look towards assessing higher order thinking skills rather than lower order, you know, really merely rote learning, memorization and regurgitation through exams. I think we really need a systematic, different way of thinking and doing things. That's not to say people aren't doing it, but I see it everywhere. I see the MCQ type of exam, or objective type, or subjective type questions, objective type questions, even in examinations. But I think assessment can be far, far more. And I think MA is moving towards that, but we need to rethink that even further. Can these online pedagogical techniques replace the active classroom environment, the interactive environment, and the presence of a teacher? No, no. We can have some form of presence, we can have some form of connectivity, some social presence, some cognitive presence over, you know, a video, but sometimes the important part of giving a lecture, and many of you are lecturers or faculty or teachers or have done. And thinking about it as a teacher and then as a student, it's when you are giving your lecture and then you stop and you pause and you ponder while you're sort of thinking something through your head, and then you're writing something on the board, and then you walk back up and down, and you're still teaching, but it's those pauses, it's those ponderings that sort of allow you to maybe reformulate, reshape your thoughts, you know, to think of examples. And I think that physical presence of, you know, in terms of you thinking of yourself, those physical presences are really, really important in the classroom, because it allows you to think, walk, ponder, you know, maybe do a little bit of self-analysis. Are the students getting this? Are they actually understanding? And you can actually read the classroom. Now, and in terms of reading the classroom, you're reading the students, you're seeing the look of puzzlement on their face, or the rest of it. You can't get that online. And the students also learn from each other in the classroom. They, you know, like a question or a pause, a question that somebody asks is, oh, I was thinking the same thing. And that kind of synchronous communication can't really go on in large scale classrooms, I think. You know, like maybe if you've got 2 or 3 people, but even in 2 or 3 people in an online forum like this, there's interruptions and, you know, not like you could in a normal face-to-face environment. So no, that physical element could never be taken away. I hope that sort of answers the question. If everything goes online, what about job security? Not everything will go online. I think that's a big fear. I think that the biggest fear that my faculty have faced have been, if I put all my teaching materials online, will you need me anymore? And my answer is absolutely, absolutely. As a teacher, your content constantly changes. It would be rare that it wouldn't change. I can't even think of a concept where new knowledge isn't developed every single day, and the content that you teach should always be informed by the latest research, the latest discoveries, the latest understandings, the latest conversations, the latest narratives around a certain context. So no, the job security, particularly in higher education, is, I believe, is not going, you know, you can't replace that. Some people have tried to, but the demand for the actual physical classes, physical face-to-face classes is also going to be there. There's always new knowledge and new ideas. But an important part of this too is, I think this pandemic has really made people understand and really value teachers and teaching. because, you know, I remember a couple of years ago, there was a thing in the Western world where a lot of the parents were saying, oh, teachers should teach, you know, tax returns and real life stuff and all the rest of it. And I feel like, in a way, that God sort of said to them, well, you were such an expert about teaching. Here, go ahead and do it, parents. So I think that this online teaching and learning, I think, yeah, it's okay for a short time, but I don't think job security will go. And realistically, if India's to get a gross enrollment ratio up to 50%, there's not a snowball's chance in hell of people losing their jobs in terms of higher education. If not, we desperately need more teachers, but great teachers, not simply teachers. There's lots of issues about faculties related to salary and facilities in India. How can one survive? The situation is same in all institutes. Yeah, unfortunately it is. I mean, that's probably a question of economics and predicting what might occur in the economic situation here in India. There's no real way of telling, and it's not until the next couple of weeks are really going to make a big difference to how the economic world in higher education is going to be. But absolutely, we have to continue with education, and that goes without a shadow of a doubt. We have to continue with education in higher education. It can't stop. It just can't stop. Because if we stop, realistically, if we stop teaching, if we stop all of the universities, then obviously we're going to have a huge glut in knowledge, and the government cannot afford to let that happen. They have to continue on as normal, and the absolute, I think, obsession by the central government to really think about ways in which we can really continue and keep people going is really a struggle. It's a struggle for all governments and all around the world. How will the current pandemic environment affect teachers and teaching? I'm always an optimistic person. And I believe that teachers will be far more valued than ever before. I know that our students are missing their teachers so much. They're missing the connection with their teachers, their faculties. I know that that kids are missing their teachers. And I know that the parents are missing the teachers for a different reason. So I think that there'll be a large appreciation for teachers and the huge tasks that they do, and the often unforgiving task that they do. We have a lot to handle much of the time. And in my past life as an academic, as teaching, it's a challenging task. And do you ever get paid enough for so much that you do? And the answer is probably no. What are the ways to motivate and generate the genuine interest of the students in the ongoing topic? That's the perennial question. In online learning, I found that I had a formula, and I ended up by putting that into a face-to-face environment, except a bit longer. And I had, you know, a 15-5 approach. So a maximum of 15 minutes teaching, 5 minutes them discussing, 15 minutes teaching. So you're breaking it up and down. And I think that that's the way to motivate students a lot more, is to create a far more engaging content and for them to add to the topic and discuss around that topic. I've seen it around the world for many, many years. I've been teaching online since, I think, 2003, and yeah, it's hard. the important thing is to remain relevant for our students, really remain relevant. So many of us forget that the gap is growing wider and wider between us and our students. Our students are still remaining the same age, if that makes sense. So we teach a lot of students, and then the next group comes in, same age, next group comes in, same age, next group comes in, same age. Meanwhile, we're getting older and older and older. So the gap is getting wider. So how we remember, oh, students don't study like they used to do. Oh, they're so much naughtier these days. I can't hold their, they're so distracted and all the rest of it. Maybe we were just as bad. And I can hand up and say I was pretty naughty as a student. I was pretty naughty. Even from a 6-year-old, my poor mother, I feel so sorry for her. And my poor teachers. I was probably always a bit bored in my classes because a lot of the classes I didn't actually find very relevant. And even, I found them dull and boring, and they didn't engage me cognitively. So maybe it's about thinking how, what would be of interest to the students, and the things that are interesting to the students are generally videos, three-dimensional, things like you find on Instructables.com. Instructables.com has always been my go-to friend, especially for architecture, those in design and architecture. Instructables is always your best friend, but doing things and making things seems to be far more interesting and engaging for these kind of students than in the past. Before, it was more like reading, writing, arithmetic, memorizing, writing down words, doing essays, all the rest of it. This generation of students has grown up with the smartphone, the instant answer, not that the instant answer is always correct, but the videos that display things, show how things are made, show how things are done, they're far more interesting and engaging, I think, for people these days than ever before. And I think that's how you can keep them engaged as well. Is it not really essential to train the faculty to be effective in online teaching? Yes, absolutely. I didn't have a chance to really train my faculty. I'm really training on the go. But yes, it's very hard. It's very different teaching, very different style of teaching than teaching face-to-face for sure. In the current situation, does the teacher get themselves updated so as to maintain the interest of students? How do your teacher get themselves updated just to maintain the interest of the students? What are the different learning strategies or activities that teachers can undertake in the current situation or learn to teach the subject content in the field they teach? Most of teaching is actually research. Majority of teaching is actually research. One can never stop. You have to constantly read, constantly look, constantly understand. There's things like, for example, say, for example, if you want to know something about, chemical engineering, you then probably go and, you're looking at things like MITx. They have a wonderful, wonderful repository of videos of people showing different ways, just having a lecture. But you're not necessarily watching the lecture, you're watching how somebody teaches and whether they have some examples that you might plug into your lecture or your teaching. I say that in teaching, teaching your actual physical teaching is the majority of the work, but research should take just as much time as you teach, if not more. Keeping yourself updated, researching on different methodologies, different things within the field and different narratives, different discourses around your topic, around your subject, is always so important. And I think that was what I referred to before, is will teachers ever become obsolete? I think that if the teacher who doesn't research and doesn't understand their topic and doesn't understand new and current technologies and narratives and discourses around the field and research that's in the field, yeah, then that teacher will become obsolete. But those that have new, interesting things that other people are doing across the world, not just within your own sphere and within your own college or university or within your own state or within your own country, it's about looking and seeing what other people are doing and being humble enough to admit maybe I could do things in a better way. Is it possible to promote basic values like discipline, punctuality and teamwork?
Questions are just increasing, Marisha.
Yeah, well, and tell me any time that people want to. Yeah.
I think you should take this question and we should end it here.
Okay. Is it possible to promote basic values like discipline, punctuality and teamwork through e-classes? I'm not sure. I'm really not sure because it's basically, I mean, yeah, there can be things like you can teach basic courtesy, basic professionalism, all the rest of it. Yeah, sure. But I'm not sure that the discipline and being on time and courtesy. I'm not sure. I don't really think so. I think those things are about nurture. They're things that are not within us each. I think there are, there's a whole debate between nature and nurture. And I think that there are some things that are inherent in nature, but there are things and values that you've just said that belong in the nurture. And I think the face-to-face is in the nurture category rather than the nature category. And I'll finish on that I discovered when I came to India, I discovered there were actually two different time zones. Time zones being Indian time and Indian Standard Time. So Indian Standard Time is on the clock and Indian time is depending on where you are in India. If it's Delhi, Ravi will probably agree with me, it's about half an hour-ish later. Am I right?
Yeah.
But then I've discovered here in West Bengal, it's sometimes only like 5 minutes. So I've gotten too used to the undisciplined Delhi way. And here I am, half an hour later, I'm chicken, no problem. Yeah, well. On that note.
Great. So,
thank you.
Amazing session, Dr. Marisha. I think it was very informative. And I can see the chats and I can see the questions.
Yeah,
which always it's like saying that the people are enjoying it. People have really liked it. And thanks for taking your time to do that. And before we end this, I will request all the audience, if you have liked this session by Dr. Marisha, please share it on the Facebook and LinkedIn and Twitter so that it reaches to a lot more people. I think we had some amazing session here. And before we end this, I will request Dr. Marisha that you have known a bit about Elets. You have visited our office event. So your impressions about work we do and your suggestions for us.
You know how I feel about Elets. Spreading knowledge about our disciplines, and that is that research and that connection to our academic world continues to be fantastic. I think it's been very fortuitous. I think this pandemic for Elets, because it then really highlights what you've been talking about all along, is the E aspect of it. And I would say with Elets, you really were ahead of the game and you are ahead of the game. And now I think what would be really important is to take some of these questions and actually think about how do we actually respond to these in a systematic way that actually benefits all of the higher education community. I think having all of these questions and answers really, it's not just questions and me answering it, it's about creating a narrative and a discourse around what are we doing, how are we doing it, what are you doing that may help me. And I think that's really important, is to start opening up that narrative between the challenges that we face and what others are already doing out there, knowing full well that here in India we can be a lot more agile and think about things in different ways.
Fantastic. Fantastic. So thank you, Dr. Marisha, again. This was an amazing session and amazing audience. Lots of questions, lot of chats, and I think people are actually asking for more. So we will perhaps organize another session, and we will ask audience to actually send questions in advance, and we can then take it up. So with this, thank you so much. And ठीक है डॉक्टर मरीशा आपको यहाँ पे thank you.
Thank you, Ravi. And
Namaskar.
thanks to the Namaskar, Dandivad, Bilkul Dandivad. And thank you to the entire Elets team and all of the audience that have been here.
Thank
and
you.
I've talked through their dinner time, so we should let them go for dinner. Otherwise their families will get rather cross.
Thank you so much. Thank you. We end here.
Thank you. Thank you.